We are live. Hey, welcome, Haseeb.
Hey, how's it going, Quincy?
So, Haseeb is kind enough to join us and share some of his insights on getting a developer job, negotiating your salary, and a new program called Earning to Give, which he'll tell us all about. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.
So, Haseeb has a really interesting history. A couple years ago, he started transitioning into working as a software developer, and the way he did that was he went through App Academy, which is a coding boot camp in San Francisco. Then he went on to teach App Academy's algorithms class for about a year, and then he started his job search. Haseeb, tell us a little bit about that job search and what that process was like.
Yeah, absolutely. So okay, let me tell the story of my job search. So when I started, I was still working at App Academy my role was technically director of product, but basically I did a little bit of everything. So I wrote a bit of software, I taught, and I also worked on businessy stuff. But basically, I had a really weird profile. So I was a career switcher, as I guess a lot of people in your audience are, and I kind of thought, because I had a number of buddies who were also instructors at App Academy who had really easy job searches. Like they had people contacting them. Things seemed to go really smoothly for them. So I just assumed that everything was going to go well because I felt pretty confident in my abilities. Like I've been studying this stuff for a while. And so I thought I'd have smooth sailing. So the first thing I did is I started applying to a bunch of companies, so like 30, 40 applications that I sent out. And a lot of the applications that I sent out were to companies that I'd actually talked to. Like I knew people there, and like had, there was some connection that I'd already nurtured. And every single application that I sent out got rejected. Like my resume went straight into the trash can. And I was a little bit taken aback, because I thought that, like, with, I don't know, with the pedigree that I had, that like I was technically even already writing software. It felt like, even though I had this really weird looking resume, at least someone should give me a chance. But I wasn't getting any bites anywhere. And so I kind of had the idea that, like, okay, maybe I'm trying too hard to get into the front door. Maybe there's another way in. And so I had the idea of starting to basically leverage my network more aggressively. So one thing I did is I had a lot of students who'd gone through the boot camp, and I had a lot of peers who had also gone through the boot camp. And I started reaching out to them and thinking that maybe if they could vouch for me, or if I had people in my network who I knew, even if it was not a super super strong connection, just them being able to say, like, hey, this guy is legit, you should go talk to this guy, maybe that would get me in the door. So I started doing that, and through that I eventually got. I remember I got my first interview at 23andMe, which is, if you're not familiar, it's like a genetic testing something, I don't know, company that sends you like a genetic test that tells you whether you're likely to get Alzheimer's or whatever.
Right, they sequence your genome real
They
quick
sequence your genome and they tell
and
you a bunch of
look
stuff.
for specific pairs.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm not. I don't want to comment too much on the company. So anyway, I do the phone screen, I do the interview, and I totally nail it. Like, I remember when I went into the onsite, like I was super nervous because it was my first interview, and I just, like, every single problem, like, I finished with extra time. I got the optimal solution. Like, all my interviewers were like, "Wow, that was really fast. People don't finish this fast." And we just sat down and like talked for an extra amount of time. So I remember, I was walking back from the BART station in Mountain View, just being like, "Oh man, I destroyed that. Like, that was awesome." Not the Caltrain station. I just feeling like just total confidence. And then the next week, I got an email saying that they'd already filled the position and they didn't want to work with me. And so that really messed with me and started really kind of cracking a lot of my confidence that this thing was going to go well, and that I was really being given a fair shot. Um, and so it turns out, I had, even despite all this, like despite all these things that were really discouraging and kind of frustrating, I'd still put a lot of irons in the fire, and I was still really aggressively applying to companies and talking to people and networking and expanding my network. And then pretty soon, a few companies that I'd been talking to finally converted into offers. So I ended up getting an offer from Yelp. Then I got an offer soon from Gusto, and then I got an offer soon from TripleByte, the company. They also connected me to companies, but they also ended up giving me an offer. And pretty soon after having these three offers, everything just kind of changed. And so I got an on-site from Google. I ended up passing the Google on-site and getting an offer from them. Once I had a Google offer, all the floodgates completely open. So all these companies that I was talking to that were like, somehow I was stuck in their pipeline. Suddenly their pipeline just, I don't know, it was like pouring grease into their pipeline, and I just kind of flew right through. I ended up getting an offer from Stripe. I got an offer from Uber. I got an offer from Twitch. And then finally, kind of in the 11th hour, I ended up getting an offer from Airbnb, which was one of my favorite companies and one of the companies I was really excited about. And basically, long story short, so I wrote a blog post about all of this, which ended up becoming very popular. So if you're curious, you can go read that blog post in a lot more detail, hear the story. But essentially, I decided to join Airbnb. And about 10 months ago, I started working there, and that's where I am now. So that's the fairly abridged story of what happened in my job search.
Right, and in that article, which I'm going to link below, you did a significant amount of negotiating and playing companies against one another, playing offers against one another to get a good starting salary.
Yeah. So yes, that is one of the things I ended up writing a lot about. It was surprising to me a little bit just how much overwhelming attention that got relative to everything else in the blog post, because I didn't really think about it that much until I realized how much people never talk about negotiation. It's kind of one of those things that people either they either think it's some skill that people either have or don't have, and that it's in some way, I don't know, like a black art. It's like unlearnable, or it's like somehow taboo to really talk about. And so I ended up writing a number of articles about negotiation for precisely this reason: is that it seemed something that it just looked so nebulous to people to really understand how to negotiate. Yeah, I can talk more about negotiation if you'd like.
Yeah, well, so you talked about the role of getting multiple offers, and like once you got the Google offer, you said that basically opened the floodgate.
Yeah.
You were able to use Google's sizable offer as leverage to be able to get a higher starting salary and compensation package from Airbnb.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the process and what was going through your mind when you went through that.
Yeah. So negotiation is tricky because on the one hand, every negotiation is about, like you mentioned, it's about having leverage and having better alternatives, right? If you have no alternative, meaning you only have one offer, or you're not working, or basically like if nothing goes well in the negotiation, you have to take the offer anyway, right? If that's your situation, then you don't have much leverage in the negotiation, because if the company is aware of that, which they usually are going to be, they have really no incentive to kind of give you more than what they initially gave you, right? Because they know whatever they give you, you're probably going to end up taking. So the best thing you can do for yourself is really seriously represent to the company, hey, I have better alternatives. So if this deal that I'm negotiating with you doesn't work out, I'm totally cool. I'm going to go take some other deal. Like, I have other options. And if a company understands that, then they're much more likely to negotiate aggressively for you. And of course, being wanted by other people signals that you're a really desirable quantity, that you're really good, that you're good at attracting attention, which probably means that you're desirable to work with. But the other thing too is that, like, a negotiation is also at the same time all about relationship, right? So like when you're negotiating with somebody, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why people are really nervous about negotiation, and it kind of strikes them as being something really uncomfortable. I think that's in some part for the right reason, because people know that they're going to have this relationship with their employer for a long time after the negotiation's done, right? And so you don't want to seem like a jerk in your negotiation. You don't want to seem really greedy or aggressive. But at the same time, I think a lot of people assume that negotiating at all makes you seem greedy or aggressive, which is not true. It's possible to seem greedy or aggressive in a negotiation. And I think if you are kind of like just ruthlessly just being like, hey, Google gave me this much, so you should give me this much, right? That's a really good way to kind of seem a little bit, kind of money hungry and not caring very much about the relationship. But so long as you pay homage to the relationship that you're going to have with your employer, and you kind of signal very clearly why you care about what you care about, right? Everybody cares about money. We all know, like, you don't have to pretend that you're a saint and that you only care about the mission and that you just love coding, right? I mean, maybe you do, I do, fine. But you also need to pay your bills. You also need to, invest in yourself. So it's totally okay to be like, hey, I would love to come work for company XYZ. I think you guys do really awesome stuff, but I have another really competitive offer, and it's tough for me to make the finances work unless you can make me a stronger offer. So let me know what you can do. I'd be really excited to come work for you guys, but it has to make financial sense for me, right? That kind of way of framing it, such as it's not like, hey, give me more money, Google's better, come on, because I have this offer from Google, therefore you should give me X. That's not the way negotiation works. Like, you always want to convey both respect and excitement for the company that you're talking to, even if you don't think it's going to work out. Like, I think being mindful of that relationship is probably one of the most effective ways that you can, one, negotiate effectively, but also kind of lower the stakes for the negotiation. Like, not make it seem so adversarial, not make it seem so intense or scary or kind of like, I don't know, bullying-ish. I think when a lot of people imagine negotiation, they think it's like this really aggressive thing, and it's not. It's really not aggressive. And if you realize that it's not that way, it's just a lot easier to do. So, yeah, I'd encourage people to take that mindset. And I talk about that a lot in the blog posts.
Yeah, and for everybody who hasn't read it, I strongly recommend you check out the. I'll link to Haseeb's blog post about how he got the job at Airbnb, but he also wrote a guide to. It's basically 10 rules of offer negotiation, and I've already linked to that below if you want to check that out afterward. So one of the things that I know, because negotiating, certainly in the Western world, we're much less accustomed to negotiating. When I travel to China, for example, pretty much everything is negotiated, and there's this culture of negotiation, and it's a norm. It's totally reasonable to have a back and forth.
Right.
In the US, you walk into a store, you don't grab a shirt off the rack and walk over to the cashier and say, hey, can you give me a slightly better deal on this? Most people don't actually do that. Actually, I have a lot of friends who come from East Asia and Southeast Asia and stuff, who are in South Asia, who are very good at negotiating, and they'll go into like pretty much anywhere and try to talk to the manager and negotiate.
Right.
And I think that's really good practice. What would you say would be a good way for people to practice getting over that kind of counterintuitive, kind of icky feeling they may have when they're trying to negotiate in advance of getting into a high stakes job offer negotiation?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's tough because negotiation, like, there's kind of, there's no real substitute for like an actual negotiation that matters, because when it matters is when a lot of elements come into play that wouldn't normally matter. But so, okay, to give I guess a clear answer, two things that I would say that even I personally did when I was practicing for my negotiations. So first of all, negotiations are something you can practice for. So it's not like, you don't just have to fly blind or like be like, well, I guess I'm gonna see how well I do when I go do this. So two things that I would say. One is kind of map out what you're going to ask for and how you're going to ask for it, right? So like, basically, I remember before I ever talked to Google initially when I started interviewing with them, I remember I was like up super late one night because I was very anxious about this conversation I was going to have with Google. And so literally what I did is, just to kind of get it out of my head, is I wrote down everything I was thinking. So basically, every counter argument that I thought I was going to give, every reason why I thought, okay, here's why actually you're saying that this is worth this much, but this is actually slightly worth less because of this, and this is another consideration, and blah blah blah. And I kind of mapped all this stuff out so that I wouldn't freeze in the moment if I just kind of have my nerves get the best of me. So that is, I think, one thing that's very helpful, is to just write it down and get it out of your head, so that it's just somewhere on paper, such that when you're on the phone to somebody, you can just look at this thing and be like, oh yeah, okay, cool, talk about this. So just like I don't want to get too bogged down in details. But the second thing I think for practicing negotiation is honestly just role play. Like, find somebody who you believe will be sufficiently tough on you in a role play and will actually give you good, useful critiques, and ask them to pretend they're Google, or ask them to pretend they're some other company. It can be a little bit tough if they don't actually know how negotiations work. But even if they don't, honestly, it's still really, really helpful, because just the process of framing your mind and getting yourself to think about, what would I actually say to a recruiter when I'm trying to ask for more? Like, when you just hear yourself talk, you'd be like, oh, I should not say that. Like, just that act alone, even if the other side of the phone doesn't actually sound like a Google recruiter, that's going to get yourself, one, acclimated to the process of asking. Like just getting the words out of your throat is in and of itself useful and will just help you, you know. And if you don't have anybody who can help role play with you, honestly, just like get a voice recorder and role play both sides by yourself, you know. Even that I think would be like significantly helpful, especially given, you know, a negotiation, you know, it sounds very high stakes, but really the way to think about it is that there's so much money on the table that you can make so easily in such a short amount of time, relative to almost anything else you'll ever do in your life, you know. In
Right.
10 minutes, you can make thousands of
put
dollars.
that in perspective. So just to give people who are watching who aren't as familiar with you, what the starting salary offers were and what you ultimately went with thanks to your effort to negotiate.
Yeah. Well, so yeah. So so not starting salary, but total compensation, which is probably the more relevant metric in
Right.
In the tech world. So that includes the value of the stock you're getting, also includes a sign-on bonus and any other non-cash or non-salary compensation that you're getting. So the total value of the very first offer that I received was, I believe, 120 something K. And the value of the final offer that I received was roughly 250K. So basically, wow, through a process of negotiation, also getting other offers, I ended up essentially doubling the value of my package.
And just to ask, like, how many weeks was it between when you received your first offer and when you ultimately accepted Airbnb's?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but probably about 3 or 4 weeks.
So within 3 or 4 weeks, you could argue that you made $125,000.
You could argue that. I don't know if that's
exactly. And of course, yeah, your base salary will be higher as well. So that's like a recurring. Every year, you're going to get basically $10,000 more.
Yeah. To be clear, that's annualized. That's year after year. Yeah. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And there had to be some point at which you realize, like, okay, this is enough. Like, I don't need to keep pushing it further. I don't need to keep pursuing. How did you make that decision as to not pursue other offers or not negotiate the offers you had any higher?
Right. So one thing that's naturally going to constrain you is time frame. And I talk about this quite a bit in the blog post about how, you know, you kind of have to time things effectively, and your job search is naturally going to trend towards ending when basically like your best offers are closing their windows, right? Like that's fundamentally where you have to make your decision. And essentially, like, you know, I mean, I guess it's possible that like after I got the offer from Airbnb, I might keep looking. But for one, I was pretty sure I wanted to work at Airbnb. Like that, I was very confident in that. But the other thing is that like as your offers come to, you know, all of your offers have expiry dates, and if they don't, you should impose one yourself, because expiry dates, especially when they're consistent among multiple offers, really make a negotiation a lot more effective, right? If one offer is going to expire, then another one, then another one, then another one, then another one, then it's very, very hard for you to actually negotiate synchronously with, you know, a number of companies and actually get to some final decision.
So I have a quick question on terminology. Yeah. So you said expiry date? Expiration date,
whatever. Yeah.
So the expiration date is, how would you contrast that with like what you call an exploding offer?
Yes. Okay. So an exploding offer, this is a thing kind of in some parts of Silicon Valley. I don't know if it's so common outside of it, but basically it's mostly at startups. And essentially what they'll do is they'll give you an offer and they'll give you 24 to 72 hours to make a decision. And basically if you don't make a decision by the end of 72 hours, the offer is gone, it's null and void, you cannot accept the offer anymore. So this is a way that companies will often basically try to get you to not negotiate and to put a ton of pressure on you to basically accept the offer on the spot or leave it, you know. So
what would your advice be to somebody who receives an exploding offer?
Yeah, so my advice to somebody who's receiving an exploding offer, and of course this is with the caveat that you know, everything. Okay, so I guess I should say this because I've received like a few pieces of email that have made me feel a little bit bad. I should note that anything you do with negotiation carries some risk. Okay, so there's the possibility that if you don't, if you just like say no to an exploding offer, you might not get the offer, right? Like that's obviously true. But so basically with an exploding offer, actually now that I think about it, nobody's actually ever told me that it hasn't worked. So maybe this has a 0% failure rate. I'd be surprised if it does. but it's possible. Basically, when somebody gives you an exploding offer, that is anathema to your ability to actually negotiate the offer, right? Because you just have no ability to actually get anybody else to make a decision within 24 hours. So that's essentially what it's designed to do. It's designed to constrain your ability to actually effectively hold a market, right? A job search is a market. You are going to the market to try to find the best buyer for your skills, for your labor. If someone gives you 24 hours to make a decision, you can't really, like, that sort of screws up the market. The market doesn't work as effectively. So your job in that case is to basically tell them, hey, I'm really glad I went through this process. I really like you guys. Like, I really, I'm really interested in working for your company, but there's no way that I can make a decision in 24 hours. Like, that's just non-tenable. The offer you've just given me, given the fact that you never told me you were going to give me an exploding offer, now that I know this offer is exploding, there's actually no way I can even consider it. This is just off the table. Like, unfortunately, you've wasted both of our time. Don't say that, but basically give them that impression. They're like,
actually call it an exploding offer if you get it. Like, should you just call it what it is?
I don't know that I would call it an exploding offer, because that is like, it's kind of a some sort of an insult, I guess, a little bit. It's not a good thing. It sort of puts it in the category that it is, but it's like, I don't know. Maybe it's best not to call a spade, but to just basically say that, like, because if you call it an exploding offer, it's like, hey, it's bad that you're doing exploding offers, right? Like, don't do that. Like, don't chide them for what they're doing. Just basically say, like, sorry, this doesn't work for me, right? Because if it doesn't work for you, then they can just be like, oh, okay, well, we'll make an exception because it doesn't work for you. You can kind of let them say that, like, it's important to let them, it's kind of a thing in negotiation, right? Like, let yourself be an exception, because essentially, like, that's what people who negotiate well are all exceptions, but you don't want to say, like, I know that you give everybody this offer, but give me some other offer, right? Like, don't say that. Instead, just say, like, oh, this really doesn't work for me. And then they'll be like, oh, great, we'll make an exception for you because you're very special and you have the special case, right? Where in reality, it's just that you know how to negotiate and other people don't. So
are these employers taken aback by your ability to negotiate in a world full of pushovers?
I don't think they're taken aback. I think there are people who are good at negotiating. Generally, the people who are better at negotiating are the people who've historically had more offers, had more options, and have been more desirable in the job market. Those are the people they tend to assume negotiate, because they just have learned how to, because they always had multiple offers. So if you just start negotiating, people will just assume that you are in that category of people. Like, they'll just be like, oh, okay, look, it's somebody who has a lot of options. We know what that looks like. It's not that weird. So I would say that if anything, people are going to respect you more generally if you negotiate, because it's a signal that you're competent and that you've done this before.
Right, and that competence could be that the halo effect from that perceived competence in negotiating could be they may think you're better at software engineering as well.
Well, okay, I wouldn't necessarily go that far, because I think that is one anxiety that a lot of people have, right? So a lot of people believe, oh, hey, but if I negotiate, then people are gonna have these, like, raised expectations, and then my manager's gonna expect all this more out of me, and blah blah blah. And I want to make it really clear that all of that is a fantasy. None of that is true. Okay, negotiating more money in your offer doesn't mean that people are going to expect you to do more work. Doesn't mean they're going to expect you to write more code, to ramp up faster. None of that stuff's true. That's all baloney. I can tell you at Airbnb or at pretty much any other company I know, nobody gives a crap how much more if you made another 10K or 15K, or if you got a sign-on bonus or whatever. It doesn't matter. Once you join the company, it's a wash. Everybody, like, as long as you're in the same category of, like, okay, I'm a junior software engineer, senior software engineer 3, whatever it is, that's the category by which you're going to be judged. Within that, your manager's not going to be like, oh, this person's getting compensated more, so they'd better, finish a pull request one day faster. No, like, they're not thinking like that. Like, that's absurd.
So regarding, like, transparency in compensation, which I think is something a lot of people are advocating for, do you advocate for engineers putting their salary out there? And
I do. I know it's tough, and certainly there are a lot of cultures that make this very challenging, and there's a lot of politics that goes into it. Specifically for myself, I mean, so one, I think just in general, like, there are a lot of social problems that can be in large part ameliorated by us just being more honest about money, and potentially about things like inequality that make us very uncomfortable as Americans, and even things like class that we really, really hate talking about, but are really, really there and kind of, inform a lot of the dynamics that we see in society. And I think pay transparency is one of those things that helps. It also, it exposes discrimination against a lot of classes of people who traditionally haven't been as well monetarily compensated, including minorities, including immigrants, including women. But even on top of that, for myself, I earn to give, and I also publicly earn to give, meaning that I talk about the donations that I make every year. And in order to do that, I
Excellent.
have to, by proxy, tell people how much I make.
So let's step back, and this is something that, for those of you who don't know a lot about Haseeb, this is one of the most interesting aspects of Haseeb, and that is learning to give. And I imagine many of our viewers have never heard of this movement.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just give us a very high-level overview of what earning to give is and why it's important?
Totally. So actually, it's funny because essentially the entire reason that I got into tech was because I wanted to earn to give. And I thought that getting into tech would be the best and fastest way to do that. So earning to give is this very simple idea. It's essentially, if you look at all the ways that you can improve the world, and you can do a lot of different things, right? Let's say that all you care about is, I want to make the world a better place. So you could go and you could decide, okay, I'm going to go work for a nonprofit, and maybe that's the best way to improve the world. Or you could decide, hey, I'm going to go and I don't know, try to volunteer on the weekends or something like that. And maybe that's one way, or just be nice to people around me. I don't know, stuff like that, right? But another way that people often don't think about is like, hey, one thing that the world really needs, and one very direct way to intervene and improve the world is with money. Like, money is what actually funds nonprofits. Money is actually what gets volunteers to be able to do good work. Money is actually, if you want to get more vaccines, or if you want to get more anti-malarial bed nets, or if you want to do any of the interventions that we already know work in the world to reduce suffering, they require money. And so if you think about it, like, well, there are all these careers that are kind of available to you if you're kind of hardworking and in the first world that make a lot of money. One of them is software. And essentially the idea behind earning to give is like, hey, maybe if you wanted to improve the world as much as possible, you could go and pursue a high income earning career and then donate as much of that money as you can to charity, kind of in lieu of directly working for that charity yourself. And when I first heard these arguments, they totally made sense to me. I was like, oh yeah, that does make sense. That does sound plausibly to me like the most good that I could do would be to go into a high income earning career that most people can't do. Like, they just don't have access to it. Most people in the world, that is. And go into those abnormally high income earning careers and donate as much money as I can to charity. So that's what I did. When I came into the tech world, the first moment I got a job, which was June 2015, last year, I started donating 33% of my pre-tax income to high impact charities. And I've been doing that ever since, and that's what I intend to continue doing as I keep working in the tech industry. So last year, the year before last, in 2015, it was my first year earning to give, and so I donated, I think $21,000, 21 or 22, something like that. And last year was my first full year of earning to give, and I donated just upwards of $50,000. And my hope is to continue doing that. So eventually, as I go into, I know that at some point tech entrepreneurship's in my future, and probably when I do that, I'll donate 33% of whatever company that I found. And yeah, this is something that is just a really fundamental part of my life. That's why I'm here doing what I'm doing, is so that I can improve the world in some substantive, real way. And I think tech is a great medium through which to do that.
Wow. So just to recap that, in case anybody can catch that, Haseeb donated $50,000 to nonprofits last year. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience. That's amazing. First of all, just to give you all a quick recap of earning to give, the general idea is, sure, you could go work for a nonprofit and work as an executive director at a nonprofit or at some of these larger nonprofits. You could try to rise up in the ranks. That is a challenge, to say the least. Nonprofits are historically underfunded and to some extent underappreciated, in my opinion. And a lot of the work they do is not particularly glamorous. It's just nuts and bolts, getting mosquito nets and distributing them. I mean, that's how you combat malaria. How do you solve the big problems of the day? Well, a lot of them are not big splashy things. They're just things that require a lot of resources to go out and accomplish. So instead of trying to become an executive director of one of these organizations and lead that way, or instead of volunteering your time as a physician, for example, to go and serve in Doctors Without Borders, you can earn a whole lot more money, and you can focus on earning as much as possible and then donating as much as possible to those organizations, so you can fund them that way. So it's an alternate way to help.
You can think of it a bit as like, sort of a modern day Robin Hood approach to life, like that's kind of the way that I not that I imagine myself, but I imagine sort of the practice of earning to give in our society. It's kind of weird. Like, it definitely gives you get a lot of looks from people who don't really have a category in their mind for what exactly that is. But it's I don't know. It's what keeps me motivated, and it's what makes me proud of the work that I'm doing.
If you don't mind me asking, and I think you published an article, which I'll link to below, where you talk about the organizations you support. How did you decide which organizations to support?
Yeah, totally. So so the way that I think about giving is under the rubric of effective altruism. So effective altruism, if those of you are not familiar, it's like a movement that came out of Oxford and Cambridge like 5-6 years ago. And essentially, it's a very simple idea. Basically, the idea is when you think about doing good, when you think about altruism, most people kind of turn off their brains when they hear the word altruism. They're like, oh, okay, so let's teach violin to people in the inner cities, or just something that sounds good and kind of gives them this warm glow on the inside, right? But the way that they think about business, the way they think about economics, the way they think about almost anything else in their life is exposed to a lot more scrutiny and rigor than what should be one of the most important things, which is helping people, right? You should be really, really rigorous about the way that you try to help people, because it really matters how much people get helped, how much suffering gets alleviated, and what doesn't actually happen. So the whole idea of effective altruism is, what is the most effective way to actually help people, right? And not constrained within a particular category. So not being like, okay, well, I want to do breast cancer stuff. So what's the most effective way to alleviate breast cancer? Or I want to do children's health. So what's the best way to alleviate children's health? Kind of stripping away all of those categories and just asking the fundamental question, which is really what we all care about, is how do I reduce suffering? Because it doesn't, I don't really care whether it's suffering from breast cancer or suffering from malnutrition or suffering from whatever. All suffering's bad. I hate all of it, and I want to improve anything that I can, right? And so effective altruism essentially says, how can we improve the world most effectively given X amount of resources? And so if you look at some organizations that do this sort of analysis, GiveWell is one of them. So I donated actually quite a bit of money to the top GiveWell charity, which is AMF, the one we've talked about anti-malarial bed nets, and basically other parts of the effective altruism movement, which I think are very effective at galvanizing people to start thinking more this way, and kind of spreading a lot of these memes and ideas, which I think are very effective to get other people to give more and ultimately have these larger effects on society. That's kind of where I try to put a lot of my money towards.
And just out of curiosity, I'm going to be looking all this stuff up after the call.
Awesome. Great.
One of them, is a base metric like number of healthy years lived or something. Like there would obviously be like a bias toward helping young children
Right.
and preventing infant mortality and things like that.
Absolutely.
Is that factored in?
Yes.
Do they, instead of looking at the aggregate number of people helped, do they look at the
right.
Healthy years to be lived?
Totally. That's exactly right. So the way that, specifically the way that GiveWell, which is probably the most well-known and most respected, effective altruist organization, the way that they analyze interventions is basically using essentially the same way that global health is kind of measured, which is this notion of what are called QALY, which stands QALY, which stands for quality adjusted life years, which is essentially the number of years of life that you're saving, but adjusted for quality, right? So like if you have 5 years of life, but you're going to be blind that entire time, maybe that kind of sucks a little bit less than if you had 5 years of life, you were totally healthy, right? If you're a child and you're avoiding an early death, then okay, that's a lot of years of life we're adding to your life. But if you're an old person and you're about to die, then maybe, okay, yes, we could spend a lot of money on you, but you wouldn't actually get that many years of life relative to a younger person who has much more potential lives to still live, potential years to still live, rather. If you're a Buddhist, maybe potential lives. So yeah, that's exactly the way that essentially these things are analyzed.
Interesting. And I have to point out the obvious. It's completely the opposite of how healthcare in most countries works, where
Exactly.
a bulk 80% of your healthcare consumption will happen in your last year or two of life. I
Right.
think is the commonly cited statistic. If you think about it, if you flip that and spent 80% of it on the first few years of life, that could have such a huge impact.
Yeah.
Of course, it's politically hard to do all these things.
Oh, it's politically and culturally hard. I think it's just as much a problem of culture as it is a problem of our institutions.
Yeah.
I don't want to delve too deep into
I know we could talk
a little bit left field. I don't
healthcare and stuff. I read a lot about it, and it's something I care about. So I have linked to your Twitter account below. I strongly encourage everybody follow Haseeb. He has some really insightful tweets, and he writes a lot of articles, several of which he has published in FreeCodeCamp's open source community and Medium publication. And we're looking forward to hearing a lot more insights from you, Haseeb, in the near future about getting a developer job, about negotiating wages, and about continuing to learn on the job, all these things that you're vocal about. And of course, we're always interested to hear your periodic check-ins on how things are going with Earning to Give.
Totally. Thanks so much, Quincy. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me.
Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you to our live audience for tuning in.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a beautiful day.